Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Mike Nuno, and I am the Vice President of Philanthropic Services here at the Community Foundation, and I am also the moderator of today's event. Thank you all for joining us. I'm going to introduce the panelists momentarily, but before that, I wanted to give you a little bit of my background. So prior to joining the Community Foundation, I worked as a major gift officer on the nationally deployed team for the National Audubon Society. I also worked with Climate Central, who we have some representation of the panel here today. Climate Central is based in Princeton, right off of Nassau Street. And then I also worked for an international animal welfare organization that was headquartered in London. This is basically just like a long way to say that I really care about the environment. It's near and dear to my heart. So I really appreciate everyone here joining today to learn about environmental justice. I do want to give a quick shout out to some people who are here with us today. We have some former trustees here. A special shout out to Jamie Sapo, who's here. She's also one of our advisors to the Bunbury Fund here at the Community Foundation. And then thank you all for being wonderful partners with us as fund holders at the Community Foundation. We really strive to be a leader in supporting all of you in all of your philanthropy. And our event today is really designed to help all of us learn about environmental justice and the role it plays in our local community. And we're going to sort of cover the following topics, so I just want to set it up for you. We're going to start with definitions, just so we can all speak the same language. We'll be discussing the science and visualizations behind our work, why environmental justice is important to emerging communities, access to environmental education and resources, and ultimately developing environmental advocates to become trusted messengers for the field. So now I'm going to introduce our panelist. With us today, I'm going to start with Renata Barnes, who works with the Outdoor Equity Alliance. Renata, I don't know if you want to give a brief introduction to yourself.
Hi, everybody. I'm Renata Barnes. I am the Director of Programming and Community Engagement for the Outdoor Equity Alliance. Hey.
And go ahead, Pri. You're muted.
Yes, sorry. I'm Pri Oliveira. I am the Outreach Specialist at the Watershed Institute.
And finally.
Hey, everybody. I'm Bernadette Placky, Chief Meteorologist and Director of Climate Matters at Climate Central. I also get to work very closely with the Watershed on their board.
Well, wonderful. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Thank you all the panelists for being here. I really appreciate it. Just so we're all on the same base, I thought we could maybe do some definitions. So Renata, maybe you want to help us with, and this can be any panelist, please feel free to join in, defining what your definition of environmental justice is. And if you want to discuss also the term emerging communities. You're muted.
I'm going to get this muted thing right, folks. I'm telling you, I'm going to get it right. I want to start with emerging communities. One of the reasons that I use that term is there's a weightiness, if you will, to terms like underserved, overburdened, underprivileged, at risk, marginalized, minority. And it is one of those things that is put on people. And it allows, what it disallows is people the freedom to self-identify and also even to be self-perpetuating and self-encouraging because you're always looked at in a particular group, in a particular way. What emerging communities does, it allows people to, and in those groups, it allows people to have a sense of coming out from under, being able to achieve, being self-determining. So let me just define what those groups are. Emerging communities are it's a very negative term, but it is, emerging communities is a positive term. It is people of color, differently abled people, undocumented immigrants as well, the elderly, the LGBTQ communities, people who identify as people of color, whether they're biracial or multiracial. And there's probably some others in there, but that's what I mean by emerging communities, people who have historically been on the periphery.
Great. Thank you, Renata. And I think we also want to, we have a guest with us today, a fund holder, Lisa, who was going to talk a little bit about how folks, neurodivergent folks fit into that definition and access, environmental access for those who are neurodivergent. Renata, do you also mind sort of defining how you define environmental justice? And Bern and Pri, if you have anything to add to this definition, please feel free.
Well, the idea of justice, just in and of itself, the base definition is philosophy or morals or way of being or a governmental entrenchment of a saying of some kind of that is impartial, that looks at people impartially and distributes the law and distributes things equally. So when I look at the idea of environmental justice, I kind of see where people have been either pushed to the margins or not included. So in my mind, environmental justice is the outside, its benefits and its care in the hands of every person who consumes from that. And it's important that each and every person understands their responsibility.
Great. Bern or Pri, you have anything to add? If not, Bern, it would be great if you wanted to, Bernadette, sorry, if you don't mind sort of walking through some of the work that Climate Central does regarding sea level rise in your Climate Matters program, and sort of how it affects these emerging communities, both locally and potentially even internationally.
Absolutely. And I did, for the value of time, we have a lot of international stuff I can get into later, but I really did try to focus in on New Jersey, since we are a New Jersey audience here. And I'm going to show you a couple of slides. The only thing I have to add, because Renata says it so beautifully, is to me, it comes down to voice. And right now it's an unfair representation. And the real goal is to get a fair representation and voice across all of those spectrums that Renata already said. So, I mean, well done, Renata. How much more to add than that? So I'm going to, with time, get over to these slides, and please let me know if you are seeing them, because I'm working on two screens here and I want to make sure you're getting the right screen. Do you have that now?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'm going to show you is through our work at Climate Central. As many of you already know, we're a nonprofit really focused on science and communication. Science drives everything we do, but the goal is to help people understand how climate change is impacting them and what can be done about that. And we have a lot of different projects and programs we've taken on over the years. But two of our core programs are our Sea Level Rise work and our Climate Matters work. And I have a couple of visuals to show you from here, because visualizing science and data can help people understand things a little bit more. And to start out, we had done this really interesting project with our journalism department. And I'm going to drop the link in the chat in a moment here. But it really focused on the injustice of the floods along Atlantic City. And ironically, so many people think of sea level rises coming up from the beaches, but the way we've engineered our land is it gets pushed back through the back bays and it comes up in that direction too. And as we know, the injustice part of this comes from, it does come from extreme events, but it's the consistent everyday events too that are wearing down systems of places that don't have the resources to recover from it. And this whole story really dove into those streets where we're seeing flooding higher and higher on a regular basis, and how that's affecting everything from their mental health to how they have to plan where they park their cars, get their kids to school and get to their jobs. So it's a great story and a video story, and I'll drop that link in there for everyone. Another way we've looked at this, and it's been many different ways through a lot of different data, is how this sea level rise and coastal flooding is impacting a range of different communities. And one of them was affordable housing. We already know this is a massive issue across the entire country. Here in New Jersey alone, it is one of the states with the highest risk and highest vulnerability of our affordable housing being lost or affected by sea level rise. And when we looked at coastal states, you see here the highest number of houses, the housing units, and the highest percent of affordable housing stock, both now and projections into 2050 here across New Jersey. We have all of this on our website, and I'll drop some of those links in for you too. And 5 of the New Jersey cities were among the top 20 around the entire country: Atlantic City, Hoboken, Penns Grove, Salem, and Camden. And as we know, some of those cities don't have that many resources to begin with. Another thing here too, again, daily life, how this consistency is really creeping into people's ways to operate, to plan, how they organize their day, get to their job. And this was showing up from the caretakers and the education in Atlantic City. And this is a partnership journalism story we did with the Atlantic City Press. It's a really interesting story, but a couple of pieces just to highlight from this here. 3 of the city schools in Atlantic City are in locations that make them prone to experiencing coastal flooding at least once a year on average. Now, going forward, another 4 have annual flooding somewhere on their grounds. And by 2050, that number increases to 10. So this is, people are feeling this regularly already, let alone where we're going. Another way we looked at this is through seniors and how seniors are at risk on many different levels here. And you can dive into the data on this one. New Jersey, one of the most at-risk states with our seniors in coastal communities here, from their property values to senior housing and many different levels that we've dived into this data. Now, it's not just along the coast, because you saw Camden pop up as one of those cities. This is being pushed up the Delaware River too. And so here in Trenton, we did this project called Picturing Our Future, and this is a global one. Again, another link I can share with you, and you can really look around the world. A lot of those most at risk are really experiencing these issues already, but even here at home, this is how it looks right now. Let's take you through a couple of different images here. So what I'm going to show you is cumulative warming, and it's done in Celsius because this was a global project, and we know we're the ones who use Fahrenheit here, but we're looking at a couple of degrees of Fahrenheit warming here. And you start to see at 2 degrees Celsius, it's about 3.6 Fahrenheit, where that water is going. This is outside of any storm, right? When you get up to 3 degrees Celsius, when you get up to 4 degrees Celsius. And the thing is, in a lot of our big global models, we're still tracking on that 3 to 4 degrees Celsius range. Now, with the commitments made globally, it's trying to bend that warming curve down below 3 degrees Celsius. And if you can squeeze out all the commitments that were brought forth in the UN negotiations, it would get us closer to that 2. So that would be bringing us down to this, right? But that's still baking in an amount of warming and sea level rise that we're going to have to deal with. So let me take you through one more piece here, and I'm going to hand it back over, because we've done a lot with coastal flooding and with sea level rise, but as we know, we have this really interesting mix across the state of farmland and then urban centers, or even urban centers that have sprawled into suburban centers that are still being affected by these heat islands. And heat islands, I mean, they have equity and injustice written all over them, because you can take a look at almost every single city around the entire country, and where you see more concrete and less trees, lines with historic redlining. And this is the case time and time and time again. And people are mapping this heat in cities across the US. And it is incredible that we can range over 10 degrees, I'm back in Fahrenheit, across an area that is concrete to an area that has parks and green space. It is incredible what that can do to people's health, to cleaning up the air, to their energy bills, to how we live our life. And when we did our urban heat island project across the entire country, the number 2 on our list was Newark. Number two, an albedo is that reflection that we get back from our concrete surfaces, the lack of green space, the population density, not giving that breathing room, and the building heights. And those are the biggest issues here. And this was just a quick snapshot of the top 5 cities that we analyzed across the US. See Newark right up there. So that's a quick snapshot of what we're already dealing with, let alone where we're going. So that was to set the stage for you there, Mike.
Thank you so much, Bern. I think this is really helpful. I think one of the great powers of Climate Central is your visualizations and how, you take this information and this very complex information and make it digestible for individuals so they can really get a clear picture of, what's happening in our environment and, where it's affecting people. And so sort of expanding on, what Bern just sort of discussed. Renata, I'm curious to sort of see, what do you think the role is of environmental justice and how that plays in this bigger issue of climate change? And if you want to talk about that on sort of the local level and the work that you do through the Outdoor Equity Alliance. You're on mute, just so you know.
Yeah, I was thinking about this when we were, kind of planning and plotting. And I think traditionally the idea of how environmental justice, and particularly like the issues that that Bernadette had just pointed out, knowledge and awareness and actually being exposed to it. When we look at the group, like we looked at Newark, we looked at Camden, we know that traditionally those cities are challenged, as is Trenton, most definitely. I think the issue is getting people to understand how important the environment is. And that's difficult with people who have always been on the periphery, who have always been subject to what has been kind of where they've been placed to live, where they've been allowed to live due to issues like redlining, lack of finances, et cetera, et cetera. And I think by what our organization does and our mission is and what we're looking to do is lessen that gap by providing information, providing connections, starting with the youth, doing internships to introduce people, young people, to relationships they need to have with the environment. It's the one thing that we all benefit from. And when something happens to the environment that's detrimental, we all suffer from that too. Like, I don't know, COVID was a good example of what that looked like. When it was time to shut down, nobody escaped. We all had to contend with that. But sadly, it is in emerging communities where this is felt even more succinctly. So educating these communities specifically with people that look like them, having those people, which is where the OEA comes in the programs that we do, that we look to bolster, we look to create, to introduce people to that relationship, to foster a sense of stewardship and responsibility, and then to open up avenues for education and vocation so that the groups that have traditionally been on the periphery do not have to be on the periphery. Will have the information, the access, the availability, and the opportunity to sit at the table with the bulk of society and work together to address these climate issues. You're on mute, Mike. I loved that.
You got me. It's I think it's everyone's favorite. The slang of the 2020s, right? You're on mute.
Right.
So I appreciate that. I have some more follow-up questions regarding that coming up. But Pri, I want to sort of turn it to you, and your work is really about engaging communities, right? And sort of fostering environmental advocacy. And I was hoping that maybe you could share some examples of the importance of environmental advocacy and share some of the on-the-ground work you do and some of the personal experiences you've had regarding environmental advocacy as a young person in Newark. And you're on mute. You got it.
Yeah. No, I've been got, all right, let me share my screen really quick because as Mike said, I'm going to be focusing more on stories, and I like to show pictures of stories because I feel like just looking at me, this is going to help with the imagination a little bit more. So again, my name is Pri Oliveira. That's my Brazilian name, but everyone just calls me Pri because it's easier. Thank you, Mike and Princeton Area Foundation. I am excited to talk about this today. I'm not going to take too long on my intro slide over here, but I'm always happy to expand on some of the things I wrote here later. So just so if anyone doesn't know, the Watershed Institute, our mission is keeping water clean, safe, and healthy. We work to protect and restore our water and natural resources in central New Jersey through conservation, advocacy, science, and education. And we also administer several statewide programs. We're open every day of the week. So if you haven't been with us here in Pennington, New Jersey, please come visit us. So justice, equity, diversity, inclusion is integral to the work at the Watershed Institute because we value clean water as a fundamental human right. And as I was listening to Bern and Renata, I was thinking, yeah, I'm going to touch on some of this stuff too, but I think I'll add that kind of personal experience and story element to it, just to kind of showcase some examples we've seen. So I'm going to go through my personal experience first here, just talking about growing up in Newark. And this is a very negative looking map, but I think it displays my experience is that it was dangerous to be outside, especially in the era I was growing up in Newark. For other reasons, it was dangerous, but my parents were terrified of the environmental pollution and the hazards in the city. And this is a current map of all the contaminated sites in Newark. And yeah, so you can't get away from it up there. And everything was also gray and dirty for them. They came from Brazil, which was very lush and green, and they could go outside whenever and climb mountains. So it was a very different environment. So they were just generally afraid and unfamiliar in this space. So it was only when I moved to the suburbs and started visiting Brazil more to see family and have adventures that I had that chance to explore on my own and develop this sense of wonder for nature that wasn't just cemented in the fear of it, which is kind of echoing what Renata was saying, that we have to open up opportunities. Otherwise, I would have always just been scared to go outside. And at some point, it became very important for me to enhance that access I didn't have in my birth city for the people I loved that still live there. And more than that, I just wanted it to be a safe place for them to live. My uncle loves to fish, and he used to fish from the Passaic. So that was something I wanted him to be able to do, or at least know where he could do it. I wanted my friend to feel like she could care about the environment and get a reusable water bottle, but she was afraid of contaminated drinking water and lead at school. And when I started to learn about the issues of access and contamination later on in life, and especially when I started learning about the racist practices that made it so, I also was overwhelmed by this feeling that it's just not fair. And that's why I started getting into this work. I wanted to give back a little bit because I had the chance to do things like this, but I knew my friends and others didn't have as much of a chance growing up. So for the sake of this short overview, you're gonna have to believe me when I say I've always valued advocating for things that aren't fair, even far from home. I know my bio says I worked for FEMA, and I did that for a couple of years. And when I came back, I was ready to make a difference here in my home state. And that's when I found the Watershed Institute. And at the time, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion was becoming a bigger focus for the organization. We put a focus on identifying partners, offering invitations to our Central Reserve. We attended a lot of community meetings to listen to needs, to identify issues. And here's an example I put up of a photo where the East Trenton neighborhood and a community group over there came and visited the watershed, and we gave a tour, and it was just a very personal one-on-one relationship building time with those folks, and it was very helpful. We've found over time that these invitations are actually very important for us specifically, being that we have this reputation and of not serving in those areas. So it helps us kind of get into that a little bit. And it was only after a few years of listening in these kinds of informal settings that we started to really understand how the mission of keeping water clean, safe, and healthy has that very specific and intentional meaning for communities in our focus area of the Central Delaware and the Stony Brook Millstone watersheds. And Bern also got into that a little bit with those amazing pictures of Patriots Theater flooding and sea level rise, but we look at it, we look at it at a climate aspect as well, but we also looked at the land use and the local implications and impacts that are kind of giving a very local and periodic issue, just to say that climate is, we're not waiting for that flooding to happening. There's a lot of issues that are already currently happening. Historic discrimination and racism have caused this, disproportionate environmental and climate impacts in these emerging communities. And though our organization had always focused on addressing water quality impairments, flooding, pollution, overdevelopment in the area anyway, it was becoming apparent that there's enhanced complexity of these issues in these emerging communities. So I also wanted to just give a little preface on this, but water has a way of moving, which is a key characteristic of it in this case. If the town next door cuts down a forest for parking lots and warehouses, the rain that would have been captured down there now flows to the next town. If that town also has more parking lots and warehouses, that rain continues rushing down, and the problem accumulates until it gets to that large water body, so the Delaware River, and the water no longer has anywhere to go, so things flood, and that's the basis of the problem. This is kind of also reflected in things like water pollution and other issues. And I had a photo over here of Ida, and this was in Trenton. I think it kind of like encapsulated it pretty well. In a place that is already struggling with that aging and unfunded infrastructure, it already has those vulnerable populations, those emerging communities, historic contamination, dumping grounds. It's not just causing one problem when it floods like this, it's causing a lot of problems. The picture's a little grainy here, but there's like these little tufts coming out of the water, and that's trash that's been now in the floodwaters and now in the Delaware. So it's causing multiple problems and multiple public health concerns at once. And this was just one storm. This happens quite frequently in this area and has only become more frequent because of the issues of climate and climate change. So it's important to focus on those local and regional solutions to the problems, on these facts that neighbors can flood out neighbors. And one of the best ways we have found to institute sustainable and supported change to address issues is by empowering those local communities to actually advocate for their own change. And since New Jersey is a home rule state, or towns are allowed to come up with their own rules to a certain extent, it only further supports that opportunity for communities to lift up their own voice and their own solutions, and also that cross-community collaboration for a more regional approach that's very helpful to solve problems like this kind of flooding. Next picture over here. So through advocacy education, and this was a great program in summer we did last year for youth, and we just did 1 week on how to advocate and how to speak at land use meetings and the processes they needed to know and all of that stuff, and how to reach out to your local official. We're not only highlighting the issues and how to solve them, we're also highlighting the process itself. So we're trying to demystify how these key decisions are made, how land use decisions are made, and how residents can have their say during local town meetings. And again, like Renata said, we're asking that question: who's at the table when the towns are making key land use decisions that can either exacerbate or mitigate flooding? I mean, they could be deciding on zoning that's going to allow for more warehouses. It's going to create more flooding downstream and stuff like that. So is that table including the whole community and its different perspectives? And most importantly, is that table listening to those voices? Our goal is to educate and support that community as they navigate that continuum. I had a few more examples. So here's a good example of kind of empowerment at the regional level. New Jersey has 564 discrete municipalities, and they don't frequently talk to each other, even though they're right next to each other. So although it is only about 8 miles from Lawrence to Trenton and 15 miles from Princeton to Manville, New Jersey, where its stormwater ends up, dialogue between those two towns is very rare. So the Watershed Institute is convening forums and trying to do more of a regional approach for decision makers to connect with their suburban and urban communities. And this is an example, the Assunpink Roundtable we had last year, where decision makers from towns that drain to the Assunpink Creek, it runs from the Millstone Township all the way down to Trenton, and it discharges into the Delaware River. So it was a good opportunity to discuss how those upstream land use practices are going to help mitigate extreme flooding downstream in communities like Ewing and Trenton. And sometimes our goal is simply to just amplify the voices that already exist in the community. So you'll see a lot of partners down here, and they're doing great work on their own. They've been there a long time, and we just want to be able to amplify that voice beyond their smaller focus areas. So bringing trees and other plants into urban communities use important health benefits. So we used our platform after hearing from the community that they wanted to learn more about how trees could help to educate the supporters and the members about serious health issues in urban communities and things like that. So, oh, I went too far. So I just kind of wanted to tie it together and go through a couple of other things we're doing, because environmental advocacy is a keystone and a cornerstone in our work. But aside from advocacy and education, we're, again, the importance of actually intentionally inviting these communities over here. And like Renata said, giving them opportunities to do things they may not have been able to do before. And we're doing, to support this, we're doing things like translating materials, marketing into different languages, providing scholarships, free programming, and hosting more and more programs in those communities. And there are things like Butterfly Festival, World Water Day, Solstice Run, Trenton Community Day, Trenton River Days. There's always more things coming up. Actually, something that the Princeton Area Community Foundation is also helping us with is our camper spots. So we're doing camperships. At this point, 25% of the camp spots that we offer are these camperships, offering a bus from Trenton as well as lunch, and just being able to support this kind of young exposure to the environment for these families that, you know, they live in Trenton, but it's not always possible to bring the kids to camp every day. So it's very helpful. So I don't have to go into this, but our website has this value statement, and it's very, it resonates a lot with what Bern and Renata have already said, that these communities have been unjustly affected, and we're trying to address that through different ways. So in our minds, we think this is going to be achieved when everyone is enjoying these strong and effective protection, and there are reduced hazards, and the hazards are being addressed. And of course, like Renata said, equal access to green spaces, and also my bread and butter, which is equitable decision-making processes for creating healthy environments. So I could keep talking about this all day, but I'll turn it back to Mike and any questions that there might be. So thank you very much for having me here, and my contact if you want it later.
Thank you so much, Pri. If you don't mind, stop sharing.
Yeah, to bring it over. I have to open Zoom.
So this has been really interesting. I think about sort of what you discussed about, you know, down the river and what happened. So I live in Philadelphia, and I got that alert over the weekend saying, don't drink the water because of the spill in Bucks County. And, you know, I think this whole conversation, we've been talking about things about access, and, you know, it's sort of not just about it giving the knowledge, but it's about listening, right? And, you know, think about how the issues of water affected the folks of Philadelphia and the poor communities who were told, go buy bottles and bottles and bottles of water. You know, and it's not like the city's going to reimburse them for that, right? Like, that's not happening. So, you know, I think there's been some policies in New Jersey. There's the EJ40 policy, and, you know, I know we don't want to go too much into this, but, you know, I know some of the criticisms around that policies is really about, you know, empowering people or giving the voice people and being heard. And Renata, you really eloquently said this in our last conversation, and I'm hoping you can sort of repeat what we're looking for. But Pri, do you mind, or Bern, going into sort of what you know about the policy and sort of what we can do, or how it's a step in the right direction, but it's still not quite what needs to happen?
Letting Pri take this one.
Is that the EJ law you mean?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So I think it is a step in the right direction because it's finally making it, I guess, mandatory that we consider it. So there's this whole thing about intentionality that we've been mentioning today. It's like you have to intentionally invite, you have to intentionally include, and things like that. You need to go out of your way to make the space and bring them in. And that's kind of what the EJ law is trying to do. In a way, it's making it so that it's mandatory to review impacts of pollution, especially like air polluting facilities in New Jersey. And it's also looking at it from the geographic scope. So it's not just like air pollution impacts in this one town, it's air pollution impacts in the town surrounding that town also. So if if like Newark passed their ordinance on this and they have very specific things that they want not to be done and things like that. I haven't read it yet, but I will at some point. If Elizabeth came out with an air polluting facility that would impact Newark, now the EJ law steps in and says like, no, you have to consider the impacts to Newark as well. So it's definitely going the step in the right direction. These are rules that still need to be adopted, which is a whole other thing. And hopefully they'll be adopted next month.
Yeah, I think if I can interrupt you real quick, real quick, Pri.
Go for it.
One of the I think one of the issues with this is, and I think what Mike was alluding to is, one of the things that I always say is that there's a huge difference between creating space and making room. And a lot of these policies, though well-intended, to your point about, well, you know, if I'm looking just at what's happening at these two places, I'm not considering the broader effect. And when you don't have enough people at the table, hence creating space is me making a space for you to have just what I have, but over there. It's not going to create a space where there's a mutuality, where there's actually conversation, where someone can say, hey, we need to look beyond just ourselves. That doesn't happen in a very closed place. But making room is what I think we need to do, and is something that needs to be really at the center when we're dealing with issues, with JEDI issues, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. When you have to make room, like when Uncle Mo and them come for Thanksgiving and there's not enough room at the table, everybody has to adjust, but we all adjust so we all fit. And that way we all partake in the meal. And I think that that's what's missing, especially since, you know, JEDI and equity and these things, that's what's hot on the street right now. This is not a trend. And we've got to make it part of our DNA, as it were, to make sure that we are inviting, that we make room at our tables to invite people in. And we're able to better address these things. Water, heat deserts, air quality, and are things that are so central to all of us. And if we want to address these things and change them, everybody needs to be at the table with knife and fork in hand.
Yeah, I'll add to, that's a great way to put it, Renata. And I'll say that I think of it as like pieces of a puzzle. So the law itself isn't going to, you know, bring people to the table and do it mutually and things like that. It's more of a framework that can be used at this point to help facilitate that, but the actual community organizing role and all of that might fall more on the community itself, on the organizations within it when there is an issue or when there is a facility that wants to expand or be created. That kind of organizing role might fall more to like the Watershed Institute or the Outdoor Equity Alliance or New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance. That's not written into the law. Like, and I don't, there are some laws that do that. Like, I think wild and scenic rivers makes it so that towns like have to work together on river councils and stuff like that. But this law, I don't know if that's written into it. So that's a really good point to just.
Well, that's why we have to kind of get in there. That's the idea of organizations like yours and mine with someone like Bernadette's organization giving us enough information so that we can share it widely and inform populations who Who's going to give it to them? And especially if they haven't been involved in those decisions, in that decision making for their communities. They're always kind of affected by what someone else says, this is what you need. And as those pictures showed out, especially that picture of Trenton, I remember seeing Trenton like that years ago when I was growing up, big flooding things, and realizing out here where I live, I don't ever see anything like that. It's never anything that affects me. So how is it that we can work towards making sure that the most vulnerable of people in the emerging communities is protected, and that's protected with knowledge and access and ability to be able to speak to the decisions and the things that are happening within their own communities.
I'll add one more thing to this, because all of this is so critical. It's to build that capacity, to give people, to empower people. It's not just sweeping in and trying to take care of people. And that's such a big part of what we're trying to say here, because giving people that space, giving people that voice, giving them the ability to feel they can make that change is so critical. One thing I'd like to just add, not to go too far into policy, but one of the things that from what I understand too with the New Jersey law is it's unique to the country. So it may not be perfect, but it is pushing a new area. So still more to do, but it is different than other states. So it is trying something a little bit deeper. The other thing too, the EJ40 that you referenced, Mike, is a national thing. And for those who aren't as up to speed on some of the throwing around the numbers and the letters, because I get lost too, it's the Environmental Justice 40 initiative. It's an initiative from DC and the White House right now that's an all of government approach. And the Justice 40 part means that 40% of benefits, whether they're rebates, grant access, whatever that benefit may be, is supposed to go to what is considered an emerging community. They didn't use emerging in their definition, but that's what they mean, is the emerging communities that we defined earlier. So 40% of all of the stuff that's going on right now, there's some amazing stuff that's been coming out for climate initiatives and climate action and environmental action. And 40% is supposed to go to these communities. The thing is, there's still that gap in how we make that happen. And that's why it's so critical to have conversations like this and to move forward on them.
Yeah,
I absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think there's, sorry, Pri. I think one of the things that we did discuss about was the discomfort for a lot of people in this. And I think we need to work collectively. And not just emerging communities, but people from the dominant culture, to be able to sit down and work through these things. Because like you said, like Bernadette said, we're trying to give them access and information, but we're not trying to save them. We're trying to give them everything so they can save themselves. That's where self-determination and self-perpetuation goes on. That is what creates sustainability, self-sustainability in these communities, and in these communities that have traditionally always been seen to be dependent. And that dependence is because of lack of access and lack of opportunity.
Yeah, so I guess do these policies, EJ40, the EJ rule, whatever come out, them alone don't get to the heart of the issue. Yeah, we're saying we have to pull in there, and even just saying you were saying, Bern, they have access to 40% of everything, but do they know that? Or is there even a framework on how to access 40% of everything is a big question,
right?
Yeah.
The capacity, a lot of organizations don't have the ability to have grant writers and the extra time to put into accessing that money and bringing it into their organizations. So there's a whole host of tools that need to be implemented with this.
Yes,
absolutely. That's absolutely right, Bernadette. And that's one of the difficulties is for smaller organizations and newer organizations, and especially organizations that are led by people from emerging communities, to actually have the capability to do that. They don't have a plethora of grant writers and grantors and things like that. So it's slow going. And so to take that, that 40%, as you're saying, it's like, how do we make it work for these communities? That's exactly where a lot of us are.
I will say for the EJ law specifically, and again, this isn't saying that's happening because it hasn't been adopted yet. So I'm not sure what has happened up to this point. I know it was like there was a ruling or something like that. I'm not sure what's happening exactly. But one of the things that's worked into it is that when there's a comment period or when there's community engagement, it has to be quote unquote meaningful. And that is a question mark, of course, like how do you make that meaningful? I would argue, like, I know sometimes some what are they called? Not organizations, but some groups do is that they do a comment period by putting up a sign in the middle of town that has all this like jargon and lingo, and it doesn't make any sense, and it's not even in Spanish in like a Spanish speaking community. Was that meaningful engagement? Probably not. So it has to, the law is trying to set some standards of like what that means and how to engage the communities like that. And then the next step would obviously be that two-way street. So can the communities, like without a comment period, go back and say like, we don't want this or something like that. Like you're saying, Renata, it's not just us telling them what the problem is, but them being able to say, this is a problem, we want to address it.
And they need to understand it. They need to
Yes.
understand it.
And I think,
yeah,
I think that's where our three organizations really like help each other out, working on access to the environment, bringing those initial opportunities, Bernadette and Climate Central working on the data and the science, and then the Watershed Institute also working on like, take those things you just learned and like, let's use it in practice. And we're here to help you do that. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I actually want to start opening up to any questions that any attendees have. You can feel free to use the Q&A or the chat portion if you can see that. Lisa, I don't know if you can hear me. I sent you a chat, but I'm going to allow you to talk. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about individuals who are neurodivergent and sort of what you've been working on in sort of that field. So I'm going to allow you to talk if you're available to speak, but just let me know. We'll give you a couple minutes.
I'm here. I just need a few minutes if you could hear me.
Yep, we can hear you fine. Thank you for joining us.
Sorry, my son is in a Zoom class with his teacher. I was just in with him and listening at the same time. Sure. I guess let me tell you a little bit about myself as well. I guess I have a PhD in environmental science and environmental exposure, and I've been an environmental advocate now for many, many years. I've worked at state level. I've worked at the federal level. I had a significant part in the passing of the Safe Chemicals Act back in 2016. And I've been very interested in neurodiversity and environmental justice because I feel neurodiversity is something that impacts all populations. So you have these populations that are already being impacted by environmental justice, and in some ways it could be a double whammy because these populations can also be more vulnerable because they may have intellectual disability or have some neurodiversity that makes them more at risk. A good example I like to use is, if you look at the EPA's definition of environmental justice, it includes where people live, and also where people work. And one of the things I like to include is workplace exposures. When people go to work, they're usually trained in terms of things such as, let's say, chemical safety, for example. So if you have a neurodiverse population, many of these trainings are not given in a very neurodiverse way. So some people can be auditory learners, some people can be visual learners. I have a son with autism who's more on the lower functioning level of the spectrum, but more and more companies are hiring these neurodiverse people. So sort of the training in certain aspects to make sure people are safe at their workplace needs to be more neurodiverse. There are some, OSHA did do something on this lines a few years ago, but it's still more directed towards maybe higher functioning individuals. So these are some of the things I'm interested in, as well as there's now beginning to be some studies looking at neurodiverse populations or people with intellectual disabilities exposure to air pollution. In Europe, we're seeing more of these studies done where people with intellectual disabilities are being more exposed to air pollution than typically developing populations. So these are some of the things that I have been advocating for. We did have a meeting at the EPA I was involved with where they are starting to introduce this idea into trying to figure out how EPA can become more aware of neurodiversity and making sure, let's say there's a public meeting on something, let's say when like these train derailments that are happening and they have a public hearing on it or a public meeting on it. Maybe somebody who's neurodiverse, who's has sensory issues, can't go to that meeting because they can't be in crowds or they can't handle noise or lights. How are they reaching these people? So it goes into what many of you were saying. How do we go about communicating in a meaningful way? And neurodiversity has to be part of that. And that's basically it.
Thank you so much, Lisa. It was really happy to hear from you. And as you know, as a fund holder and as a supporter to the Community Foundation, I really appreciate you speaking out and saying, you know, she got the invitation. And she's like, hey, what about this part of environmental justice? So really shedding light on all of the areas of environmental justice. And I think one thing we're seeing is, you know, it's not an easy, there's no one easy solution. So we do have a question. I don't know if everyone can see it, but the question is, what advice do you have for the funders regarding environmental justice and what we can comply? Oh, now the question got moved. And what we can apply when considering whether to fund a project or an organization. What organizations, partners do we all work with who do this well? So I don't know if anybody wants to sort of take on that question. I mean, I think all of the organizations here are working on environmental justice, but it's not limited to these three organizations in this area. So I think that's really important to consider. But does anyone have any comments around sort of what advice you would give to a philanthropist who's looking to make some, you know, some meaningful change in this area?
I think that so when you're looking at an organization and the projects, and especially the environmental justice projects that are ongoing, I'm sure as a funder, you probably feel that it's kind of dependent on which slice of the pie you're most interested in supporting, because they're all important. The access and the opportunities help pave the education in the environment helps pave the way for people wanting to care about it and wanting to advocate about it. So it's just like different parts of the process. And it might come down to looking at, you know, the communities you're hoping to support and stuff like that. And just usually a lot of these communities will be saying like, we want this, we want that, and pairing it with organizations that are already there and doing that work, like the Watershed Institute doing work in East Trenton and stuff like that. That might be a good approach. The only other thing I would say is looking at the organization and looking at the staff on the organization. More and more organizations are hiring specifically to work in these communities. And I think if an organization has that capacity, they might be good to work with, because like Bernadette was saying earlier, the community organizations in Trenton might not have capacity, but maybe there's other organizations working with them, specifically dedicated staff who are there to say like, I want to help you do this. I can write a grant for you or something like that. So that's one approach that organizations from outside communities have been taking. And it might be something to consider. If you want to support the community, you can support that staff member who is specifically working on those things for those communities. So I don't know.
And I would also, I'm sorry, Bern, did you want to go ahead and go?
Go ahead, Renata. I'll go after you.
I was going to say that what I think is really important is to partner with organizations that are led by people of color, is to work with them. And there's lots of benefit in doing that. A lot of these organizations have been doing this work for years and have been trying to make a change with absolutely no kind of support, no constant support, have been hitting the pavement. They don't have endowments or anything like that. And I think it's really important when we're speaking to emerging communities, look for these people, look at the work they're doing. If they're smaller or they might look like they're struggling, look to partner them with someone else that's doing something, because it's important to, in order to kind of strengthen these neighborhoods and to give them voices where they've never had their own voice, not puppeting through them. It's really important that they see themselves empowered, capable, and leading these organizations.
Two extra pieces I'll add to that because all that is so important. Look at how they're committed, because historically the environmental movement has been so white, right? So there are some moments where we're having discussions like this, but the commitment and the long game here. Some of it's going to take time, and we don't like that because we want change right away. But look at the commitment over time, because that's really how the language organizations are using in their commitment, not just trying to do something here, but how that filters in future years and future projects too, because some of this is going to take time. The other thing I'd say that's really important too, and Pri hit on this, but it's the full spectrum of what we need to get action. We need science and data to inform certain pieces of this. We need the on-the-ground relationships that are so key. We need to build capacity, and we need all of that for real action. So there are different pieces to this puzzle, and you'll find it within organizations like us where we're partnering with those people who are doing the great work, all of us. And so it's whether we're doing it ourselves or partnering with people, but it's really that full range that I think is critical to getting action.
Great. We do have one quick question. This is sort of our time for last question because we're getting close to 1:30. How are we all working with NJ Futures to coordinate with the work that you do, especially around quality of water? I have a feeling this is a pre-question.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think NJ Future is great. Like a lot of our organizations, and I'll say that broadly because I'm not exactly sure, but the Watershed Institute certainly works with NJ Future and working around the water quality issues and the land use, and we have staff dedicated to, for policy and for science, and that kind of plays a role on helping NJ Future with their initiatives and everything. And yeah, I mean, it's that's a big question of just like the coalitions in New Jersey that already exist, like New Jersey Future or the environmental groups that meet up and everything like that. We coordinate with each other on what we're doing, and we try to support each other. There's just always so much work to do that it's like we're all up to our heads in work, and then over that, because there's always this new grant that wants to say like, oh, can we do this too? So that's why we work with these other groups, and especially groups like New Jersey Future, who has like staff who are looking at different aspects of this, because sometimes it's just too much work for one of us alone. It's like too much work for Renata or I to do alone, or the coalitions definitely help increase the capacity. Coalitions, volunteers, community members, all those things help increase potential capacity of what you can do in these communities without, overwhelming the local community group, basically. But
Well, thank you so much, everyone. We're out of time. It was an absolute pleasure talking to all of you, especially about this topic. I mean, it's something on the top of all of our minds, and it's a really important topic, especially as we move forward in all of the issues around our community. If anybody here has any questions, we'll follow up with some links to each of these organizations who shared this information with us today. If any of you have any questions about your philanthropy, if you want to create a philanthropic plan that has social justice involved. If you want to leave any legacy gifts to any organizations working on environmental justice, please feel free to contact me at any time. I am here to support you. I've just put my email in the chat, so did Renata. Like I said, we'll follow up with just emails, and for any questions that people have, feel free to reach out to me or any of these panelists. We'll be happy to talk to you more. But in the meantime, I hope everyone has a wonderful weekend, and go Phillies. That was for you, Bern. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thanks for
all.
having me. Bye.